Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this 30-minute webinar. We're glad you could join us, and we hope that you all are staying safe and healthy. Next for Autism hosts 30-minute webinars each month to cover the topics we get asked about the most. Two of the most frequently asked questions that we receive about employment are, should I disclose my disability to a current or potential employer? And also, what is the best way to disclose a disability to a current or potential employer? You should leave this session with ideas and information you can immediately use in your work recruiting and or supporting employees with autism and other disabilities. Today, we will respond to those previously mentioned questions by discussing self-disclosure. Whether to disclose a disability at work, school, or in-home settings, it's a deeply personal decision. The intended and unintended consequences can impact the lives and relationships of the individuals disclosing. For this reason, we advise our viewers to seek guidance and weigh the pros and cons of their specific situation, because every situation is unique. It is up to the individual to determine the pros and outweigh the cons. For this reason, we feel strongly that it is not our place to advise you whether you should or should not disclose, but instead providing the beginning framework that you can use to guide your disclosure decision-making process. I'm Lauren Steinbacher, the Director of Corporate Consulting here at Next for Autism. And before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to explain just a couple of things about this webinar. During the webinar, you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them in the question box on your control panel. We will do our best to answer the questions throughout by responding back to you, and then field as many questions as we have time for at the end of the session. To practice using this question box, I'd like to ask you all a question. What is the one thing that you would like to learn today? And please go ahead and fill it in your question box. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of those responses. Great, some people want to learn about employment, the pros and cons of disclosing, when to disclose, when not to disclose. Great, no, this is great feedback. Thank you, everyone. So now I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today. His name is John Bryson. He's the Senior Manager of Corporate Consulting here at Next for Autism, and he's responsible for helping companies design, develop, and implement disability-focused diversity and inclusion strategies. He also coaches schools and adult service organizations on how to improve employment-focused programs and services. He has an extensive background in education, vocational rehabilitation, and adult services. We both have a portfolio of customers with whom we work, providing consultative services to recruit, retain talent with disabilities. We are fortunate to work across multiple business sectors, including manufacturing, financial services, pharmaceutical, tech, retail, media, and others. We also provide consultative supports to secondary and post-secondary institutions, as well as disability service providers. We will be sharing valuable strategies today, but often the biggest challenge with achieving outcomes is implementation. If you're interested in talking with us about this and how we can assist your organization with this or other challenges, there is another document with more information that can be found in the handout section of your webinar control panel. We invite you to reach out with any questions or schedule a call to talk to us about anything that you might need. So I'll pass on over to John now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate that very much. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to get moving. I'm going to go over a little bit of an agenda so that we have an idea of what we're going to be touching on today. So we'll begin by defining self-disclosure and what self-disclosure may mean for you or individuals you support. Then we're going to discuss a quick overview of important things to consider when making a disclosure decision at school or in home settings. And from there, we're going to get into some of the meat and potatoes of the session today, looking at some of the most common reasons people choose not to disclose and most common reasons they choose to disclose. And then wrap up the webinar with the most important part of the session today, which is helpful tips for making a disclosure decision framed around helping you weigh the pros and cons. So really more in the form of questions. We will end with a brief summary, just reviewing what we covered, and if we have time, questions. But if you do ask questions throughout, as Lauren advised you with the question box, we will respond to you via email or schedule a call to discuss questions you do have if we don't respond to them today during the 30-minute session. So I do have a quick little disclaimer, and that's that Next for Autism does not practice law or provide legal advice. Viewers of this webinar should contact their attorney to obtain advice with respect to any legal matter. No viewer of this webinar should act or refrain from acting based on information on this webinar without first seeking legal advice from counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. I just want to make sure that's clear up front. So what is disability disclosure? It's really important to understand what disability disclosure means as an individual and how it might impact you and your experience in work. And also we'll be touching briefly on how it might impact you in school situations and in your home life as well. A majority of this session is definitely focused on employment though. So disability disclosure is the act of notifying your employer or potential employer that you have a disability. Now, this act, as it's described, shouldn't be taken lightly, even though it might seem like it's encapsulated into one sentence. Disability disclosure likely represents the culmination of a period in which an individual considers potential consequences based on personal experience, available information they have, excuse me, and then evaluates that information to determine whether the consequences result in a desirable outcome. So it might seem like it's just an act, but for many people, this is a long process, and in many cases is a process that takes a lifetime to determine when they should and should not disclose. And this isn't just true for employment, even though the law, specifically the way that we refer to it, addresses employment. Disclosing can impact relationships in your life, can get you access to services, or many people fear could lead them to face discrimination. So thinking that disclosure is only an employment issue is limiting for self-disclosure. So just keep that in mind, that this isn't a simple thing. This is something that takes a lot of people a lot of thought. So I just want to make it clear, it shouldn't be something that people take lightly. It's a very, very important issue that can have both unintended and intended positive or negative consequences. So as defined by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, a person has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. That limit component is important for the definition. They have a history or record of such an impairment, or they are perceived by others as having such an impairment. Disclosure in this case could mean checking a box on an application that you have a disability, or perhaps you're given a voluntary self-identification of disability form and you indicate you're a person with a disability. It could mean that you're employed and you go to your human resources department and follow a process for reporting that you have a disability. It can look a couple different ways, but ultimately it is a decision that an individual makes that they're not forced to do. Individuals with disabilities, visible or invisible, may disclose their disability during the application process or after they've received employment. And whether those consequences result in an overall desirable outcome is something that the individual evaluates. So in a school setting, as we discussed disclosure, it's really important to think about how disclosure can affect multiple facets of a person's life. And so in a school situation, there are some key differences in thinking about disclosure. Of course, I'm going to be touching on things like the benefits of disclosure, but also some of the negative sides that people fear or are concerned about, like stigma or discrimination. And so these topics still have a place in school and in home life. And so some people fear that they're going to be discriminated against, or maybe that it'll cause some type of unwanted social outcome. But in general, in an education environment, you may determine that the benefits of educational supports you could access by disclosing far outweigh any unwanted consequences that you may perceive could be there could be potential for. So in a university setting, for example, student services offer support to students with disabilities like tutoring or modified test taking or note taking support. In some areas, they have entire internship programs specifically designed for students with autism or disabilities to help them access employment after attending a university. And many universities have just broad specialized autism programs in general designed to implement academic and social support. So those programs most of the time require some level of disclosure by the student. And so these are things that you weigh the pros and cons. Is there a concern that there's stigma that follows involvement in a program like this? These are things that are made at the personal level. And I think this is one of the important facets of this conversation that you'll find is the idea that we focus more on weighing pros and cons rather than specifically informing you that you should or should not. Excuse me. So the same thing goes for in your home life. In a home setting, disclosure can have a significant impact on important areas of an individual's life. Consider taking the time to identify places in your community that can support you in an area that you may need. So for example, transportation, some type of social service. If you have a local job center that assists individuals with seeking employment or gaining job skills like resume writing, it's quite possible that these organizations or services offer some type of specialized support for individuals with disabilities, but they're more than likely not going to offer you that unless you request it and in some way disclose that you need it. And those services may focus on improving access or improving quality for people with disabilities. And then, of course, it's really important thinking about all of the aspects of home life, whether it's social relationships and the impact disclosing might have on people you have relationships with, or healthcare. Consider the role of privacy when disclosing, particularly in the area of healthcare. So if you disclose to an individual that you have a disability and you are very private about this information, understand that unless a law protects that information, you are trusting that person with it. But if a law does protect you, say a privacy protection law like HIPAA, then you need to be very aware of how that law works. And if you sign a release of information, truly understand what it is you're releasing. Many releases of information group categories so that when you disclose something, you're giving the organization permission to access groups of information or release groups of information. And just remember, you have rights. And if you want to specify or limit the length of a disclosure, a release of information, the amount of information, who can be released to, you can specify those things. Forms are nice. Organizations love to have them because they make that process easy. But if there is something that you feel your information isn't being protected because of the way your healthcare provider, for example, addresses releases of information, take that up with them. Don't just sign it because you're afraid that you won't get service. You have a right to privacy if that's something that's important to you. So now that we're moving along, why do some people not disclose at work? There's a lot of different reasons that individuals choose not to disclose to their employer that they have a disability, because disclosing can bring unwanted consequences. We love to believe that everything is always positive and uplifting and that morals guide the way that the world works. But the reality is, for many people with disabilities, they have experienced unwanted consequences when they've disclosed. So we're going to look at some of the most common reasons people have chosen not to disclose. And these are things to consider as you begin to make your decision. I will point out, there are lots of different websites out there that offer great resources. Some of them will specifically tell you when you should and should not disclose. And I caution taking that advice, even from the most legitimate source, because it is always a personal decision. It is always something that will have personal consequences, and every situation is unique. So no one can unequivocally say you should or shouldn't in a given situation. Really what it comes down to is developing a framework that helps you evaluate specific things and determine if that is a factor in this particular case. And if it isn't, moving on to the next thing. So for example, one of the main reasons people don't disclose if they have a job, or don't disclose if they are interviewing or in the process of trying to obtain a job, is that in some way disclosing is going to cause job loss, whether that's opportunity loss or actual employment. And this is an understandable fear. Discrimination is a real thing. I'm going to touch on it later, and it can't be ignored. So you may worry that someone may assume you're unable to perform the job because they have preconceived notions about what disability means, or they lack understanding about your specific disability, or maybe you fear that a manager might think because you have a disability that you're actually going to demand too much of their time. And these are legitimate concerns. I'm going to provide you some things to consider later in the webinar that will help you address some of these concerns in the way that you think about them. I mentioned discrimination, and this is a big one for a lot of people. Perhaps you're concerned that disclosing is going to cause you to experience discrimination in a variety of ways. Maybe it's fear that you will literally be prevented the access to positions, promotions, pay, or maybe it's something more personal and you're worried that it will deny you access to social engagements or social opportunities with coworkers. Or maybe it's the concern that strictly relates to unfair treatment from managers and coworkers. And all of these are legitimate reasons, especially for someone who has a personal experience with any of these. So anyone who supports an individual with a disability, excuse me, recognize that for a lot of individuals, if they've experienced something like this, it can be incredibly traumatic and can make an individual much less willing to disclose in the future, even if they will benefit from it. So when they begin to weigh their pros and cons, something that you may not see as a significant con is much more significant to them because they may or may not have experienced it. Another one that I've heard many times when talking to individuals with disabilities who have disclosed is there have been cases where they don't want to because they want to avoid unwanted conversations. You know, they become the disability mascot in some cases and feel that they have to answer every question that someone has about their particular disability or disabilities in general. And for some individuals, particularly those with an invisible disability, they may feel that that's a burden on them, and they don't want to be the champion or ambassador of all disabilities. So much of this information is very personal about mental health, treatment, accommodations, and quite frankly, when we do training with businesses on how to attract and retain talent with disabilities, one of the areas we touch on is respecting individuals' privacy, because it's very important that people understand they shouldn't be asking certain things. Another area is just avoiding stigma in general. One of the main concerns related to discrimination to some degree, but different, is that an individual may fear knowledge of a disability will somehow drastically change the way people perceive them, perceive what they're capable of, or quite frankly, the fear that having a disability will become the defining characteristic in most of their relationships when people know about it. And that's something that many people consider when they're thinking about disclosing. So we talked about reasons why people don't, and they're significant ones for sure. Why do some people choose to disclose? There are so many different benefits of disclosing, and we're going to discuss some of the most common or most available. So first and foremost, access to accommodations and support. The law requires that someone discloses that they have a disability and request a reasonable accommodation. So if you are in need of some type of support or accommodation in order for you to do your job, even if you need support to access an interview pre-employment, these are things that the law protects. So the main reason employees and job applicants disclose is to ensure that employers will support them if they encounter challenges at work due to their disability. The ADA, the law, obligates the employer to provide reasonable accommodations if employees need them to perform the essential functions of their job. So naturally, this is one of the main reasons people disclose, not necessarily because they want to, but out of necessity. For example, let's say someone with autism is easily distracted by noises in their workspace. They choose to disclose that they have autism because what they want is to request a reasonable accommodation, and they'd like to have some type of noise canceling headphone provided to them by their employer. So that type of situation for an individual, they weigh the pros and cons, and it makes sense to them that the benefit outweighs the con. Another reason that is often appreciated a little bit is that having a disability for many companies can be a competitive advantage. We've seen this time and time again from our vantage point here at Next for Autism, that having a disability can make individuals with autism or other disabilities more valuable to the company because of a variety of different things that that company is doing, whether it's corporate social responsibility or diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Maybe they're utilizing tax incentives, or they're working with community partners to do some type of really interesting impact study. Whatever it is that the company is doing, they see the talent with disabilities as incredibly attractive and valuable. And for many companies, they're spending millions of dollars just to get their own employees to self-ID. So when you disclose, especially up front, that can actually give you an advantage over some people. So it's a strategic advantage, because when you're looking for a job, you're going to be, in this case, looking specifically for companies that desire a diverse talent pool. Obviously, there are many companies that don't have these types of strategies, but if they do and you're aware of it, you may want to consider it being a competitive advantage. So do a little research to find out. They typically do invest heavy in self-ID campaigns, and that's oftentimes a sort of a nod to the fact that they're like that. Another reason can just be personal well-being. For some people, disclosing can be a step toward well-being in general. Masking is a very significant issue for people with autism. Another way to think about it is like acting neurotypical, and people would do this to hide the fact that they have autism or some other invisible condition. And it's a strategy some people use to avoid disclosure in general, but masking can cause long-term strain on their mental health and general well-being, and could eventually cost them the job based on the consequences of that. So for some people, they may disclose simply because they don't want to feel the need to mask their disability. And if you are not aware of masking, it's definitely something that I would educate yourself on if you support people with autism. It's a really important issue. Another factor is just principle in general. For some, disclosing is just a matter of principle. For this particular reason, an individual may see sharing or disclosing their disability as a fundamentally important responsibility to further the rights and inclusion of people with disabilities, or maybe people that have their specific disability. So for some, they disclose simply because they feel like it's important for them, or maybe a responsibility for them to do so. Others disclose because they seek a legal protection. Some express that they feel disclosing gives them the ability to protect themselves against discrimination. For if they don't disclose, they're giving the potential employer or business that discriminated the protection of saying, I didn't know. And so I have heard in many cases that individuals with disabilities disclose specifically because they want to have the protection of the law, or increase the likelihood that they're protected under the law. Disclosure decision tips is really where we get into the meat of the presentation. So we've touched on self-disclosure and what it is. We talked about reasons why people don't disclose. We've talked about reasons why people do disclose. So let's just go over what I like to think of as a framework for things to consider. And they're not so much tips as they are questions in reality. But the first is in the shape of evaluating a company's culture. If you are going to apply for a job, or you're working for a business and you're thinking about disclosing, these are some things that you want to think about before you do so. This is guidance I would provide to someone, and if someone needs, provide this to their natural support system to help make the decision of whether to disclose if an individual isn't comfortable making the decision themselves. So for example, does management value diversity? Are they actively seeking to engage with diverse populations and help those populations excel within the company? Does the company employ and support people with disabilities already? Most companies are not currently reporting numbers for the amount of individuals they've hired that have disabilities. So this is an interesting one, but this is definitely information that you can find out based on just simple Google searches and LinkedIn searches, and even talking to people. I've even used the strategy of a ghost call, where you call a company but you don't tell them who you are and you're asking some questions about the company. But that's a very important one. If they're not actively hiring people with disabilities, then chances are they're not going to be as supportive of you if you disclose, or at least that's a possibility. Are there people with disabilities in publicity or marketing? Are they promoting inclusion in that space? We're seeing it more and more, which is really positive, but that's a great nod to the fact that a company values it from a culture standpoint. Have they established relationships with disability organizations, or if they haven't, even schools to allow students with disabilities to participate in some way? That's a great way to see that they're trying to build pipelines of talent. Does the organization provide ADA or disability training to employees? This might shock you, but there are many large companies that don't actually train their employees on the ADA, and you would think that that's should be common practice, but it's not for many companies. So if they're not being trained on the ADA, the likelihood that they violate the law is potentially higher. So really thinking about basic questions you could ask to see if they value disability. And then, of course, probably one of the best indicators of culture is, have there been lawsuits related to disability discrimination brought against the company? And this is information that can be widely available. It's an interesting Google search if you ever feel the need to take a look. So these are things that you want to consider when you're thinking about company culture. And this, again, very valuable before you apply, but can be significantly valuable if you're already working for the company, because you're probably going to know a lot of the answers to these questions. And if many of the answers are no, it might not be helpful to disclose. But again, this is a decision that you have to make based on information you have available. Evaluating personal impact. So this is where you start to think, how will disclosing affect me personally? First and foremost, will accommodations help me perform the essential functions of my position? Maybe you're concerned you're going to lose your job because of performance-related issues. So another way to phrase this question is, will an accommodation help me keep my job because I will be performing better? If you don't know a lot about accommodations, and maybe that's preventing you from answering this question, you can contact the Job Accommodation Network for more information about accommodations. They have a great resource that you can find information on so many different types of accommodations. In no way will I say it's every accommodation, but some really innovative things on there if you're thinking about what's available to you to help you answer the question. Another question you can ask is, if I determine I don't need accommodations, is there a reason it's still important to me to disclose? Say in the example of it being a principal issue or your well-being. So if you don't need an accommodation and you feel that your disability isn't obvious, then perhaps this is something to consider. And then, of course, how will the decision impact your mental health? Will you feel more comfortable because you disclosed, or less comfortable because you disclosed? I worked with a company who had an employee with a seizure disorder, and the employee wanted everyone to know and wanted everyone to get training on the disorder, specifically because it would make him more comfortable knowing that everyone knew how to respond if he ever had a seizure. So in his specific example, comfort was a very important aspect. So, we've talked about all these different areas. And again, I want to say disclosing autism or other disabilities is a personal decision. We urge you from Next for Autism to weigh the pros and cons before deciding what the right answer is for you, and be very cautious when someone tells you you should or shouldn't, because they may not have the information you have. And so really, really take what others say or organizations tell you with a grain of salt. We covered what is self-disclosure, why not to disclose, why to disclose, tips for making decisions, and we talked about disclosing differences in disclosure for school and home. So with that, it's 3 o'clock. We're going to look through all of the questions here. I do apologize for not having enough time to cover questions, but we'll respond via email. We hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for joining us and supporting us. We really appreciate it, and we hope you all have a wonderful holiday week. Take care.